Welcome to Spooky Ass Shit. I am your host, Eric Dwinells, and of course, right as I start recording this, my little familiar, my little cat, Emma Jean, has started pouncing around all in front of me, so that I might get a little distracted while I do this intro, but I think you'll all understand. I'll put a picture of her on Instagram if you haven't seen it yet, and you guys will fall in love with her big green eyes just as I have. Anyway, welcome to Spooky Ass Shit. I am your host. Emma has moved on to do her business, so let's do our business. Tonight, speaking of Instagram, I put a question out there via my Instagram story, which I think I used. It might have been the first time. I'm still, I'm basically an old man, right? And I'm still, even though I'm kind of young, but I'm an old man when it comes to technology. I'm a late adopter to these kinds of things, and I'm really just starting to figure out Instagram after having had the account for several years now. But we are at Spooky Ass Shit on Instagram. And I posed the question there. I said, what do you guys want me to do an episode about? And I gave you some choices, and the winner was Uncaught Serial Killers. So, of course, there's a lot of them out there. And if we go through history, there's a ton, of course. But I just chose, I think I got 4 or 5 on my list tonight. And I wanted to go with some, you might have heard of them, but these aren't like, Jack the Ripper or the Zodiac Killer, which are, of course, very interesting cases to talk about. And we have talked about Jack the Ripper, and I'm sure we will talk about the Zodiac Killer at some point. But I wanted to cover some that maybe don't get as much attention, although some of them were featured on Unsolved Mysteries, so, I can't say that they're, obscure. But I think you guys are going to find them a bit more unique than the average, list of Uncaught Serial Killers, and I hope that you will enjoy tonight's episode. Before we dive into it, I want to tell you about the website, that is spookyas.com or spookyasshit.com. They both take you to the same place, and that is the show's blog page. From there, you can listen to each and every episode, even the ones no longer available on iTunes or your favorite iPod streaming service. You can also find links to all of our social media. We are at spookyasshit on Instagram. That's ASS. And you can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. And there you can join our closed group, the Spookaroos, where we really get down to the nitty-gritty and we can have deep philosophical conversations about the episode each week. Although most of the time it's people posting memes. But, they're still spooky and horror related, so you might like it. So check that out. 2 more pieces of business before we move on. I want to remind everyone that I will be appearing as the one and only Witchfinder General of Salem, Massachusetts, in a very rare, in fact unheard of so far in my career of witchfinding, appearance outside of the Halloween time frame, which of course in Salem goes from September to October. But I will be appearing as the Witchfinder in Salem this Saturday, February 8th, in front of the old town hall in Derby Square with my fellow street performers for an event called the Salem Monster Hug. For $1, you make a donation, and all proceeds go to the Boston Children's Hospital and the good works they do there, and you get to hug the monster of your choice. I don't know if $1 buys you one hug or if you get to hug any of the monsters that you choose from that point on. Now, like I said last time, you might be thinking that the Witchfinder does not qualify as a monster, but if that's the case, you clearly have not met the Witchfinder. He is not nearly as kind as I am to all my spookaroos. So, if you are in the Salem area, or if you've ever wanted to have an excuse to visit Salem, this is a very rare chance. Usually the Witchfinder would not be giving out hugs. But for the children, he has agreed to participate in this event. So please do come check us all out at the Salem Monster Hug. And last piece of business here. I just want to prepare you a little bit and tease you a little bit. We are coming up on the anniversary of the show, which I call the start of the new season, although I don't really take any time off, so it's kind of arbitrary to call it the new season. But the show's birthday is, I believe it's February 18th. It's right around that area. I forget the exact day, but I believe it's February 18th. And, I've been doing this show since 2016, started 2016, and it's been a grind. And I love it. I love doing the show. I love hearing from you spookaroos. I love meeting new people. And the good news is I am going to continue to do the show. So don't take this as an announcement that the show is ending. However, I do have to make some changes. And I hope that you will understand and that you will agree with these changes. But the way the show has been going and growing has not really been working for me. as someone who doesn't do this as a job, someone who does this as a hobby that I really enjoy. But I do either I need to get a little bit more return on the investment, or I need to find a new way of doing it. And perhaps I can do both of those things. And so there are going to be some changes coming. I don't want to get too much into it this week because I actually want to save it for next time we talk, which hopefully will be next week. And I'll explain all about it in the next episode, but I just want you to be prepared. The show is not going away, so please don't think that I'm saying that. But there will be some changes afoot, and we'll talk about it all next time. But tonight, let's get into the topic at hand, which is Uncaught Serial Killers. Now, I did look on some websites to try to find a good list for you all. And like I said, the big names, of course, Jack the Ripper, we've already done an episode about. Zodiac, I would love to do an episode about, but I just feel like that's kind of like a Manson family situation where it's such a big case. You want to cover it in more than one episode. And also, there's so many other great podcasts out there about it already. People have already talked about it a lot. And like I said, it's not like these ones are obscure, but I guess what I'm saying is, don't yell at me if you've seen these on a list before. I didn't say that these were exclusive to the show. I'm just saying these are not the ones that you hear all about all the time. So let's get into it. Number 1 on our list is an uncaught serial killer known as the Doodler, also sometimes known as the Black Doodler. This is an unidentified serial killer, and they don't know exactly how many people he killed, but they believe it could be as many as 16, and that there were also some men who got away from his attack. Now, he was killing people in the LGBTQ community in San Francisco between January of 74 and September of 75. He was given the nickname the Doodler because he had a habit of sketching his victims prior to having sex with them. Once their sexual encounter was over, the Doodler would suddenly attack his victims with a knife. The bodies would be left in the remote areas of local beaches. Police would come to believe that both the sexual encounter and the attack happened right near where the body was discovered. 3 unidentified men were able to escape their attacker and reported the incident to the police. That's why we know that this person was out there, and that's why we know he did these doodlings. Now, some online reports will say that the Doodler was given that nickname because he did drawings of the victims after they died. That is not the case. In fact, we know about him because he was doing these drawings to people before he attacked them, and the survivors went on to say, yeah, he asked if he could do a sketch of me. He did a sketch of me. We had a sexual encounter in this remote area, and so on and so on. Because this is still considered an ongoing investigation, the police have not released much information about this case. But they do say that the Doodler is believed to have killed anywhere between 5 and 16 homosexual males. Police initially theorized that there could be as many as 3 perpetrators involved, but they eventually narrowed down their suspect pool to just one single unnamed man. Police did bring their suspect in for questioning, but they never released his name, though he was described as a slender 20-something African-American male. The police have stated that although they do have a prime suspect for these murders, they couldn't pursue criminal charges against him due to lack of physical evidence, and because the 3 men who survived his attack and escaped, they all refused to press charges against the suspect because they feared being outed as being gay men, or part of the LGBTQ community anyway, by having to testify in court. You have to remember, this was a very different time, 1974 and 1975. It could mean a lot if you came out. It wasn't, I mean, it's not that it's, a pleasure cruise today. It's still people, LGBTQ people, of course, still face many hurdles in their lives. But at this time, it was much, much worse, even in a place like California. California politician and gay rights activist Harvey Milk spoke about the case, saying, quote, "I can understand their position. I respect the pressure that society has put on them. These men probably fear the ramifications of coming out to their families or their employers. That's why so many gay men choose to stay closeted. Among the stabbing survivors, there were a well-known entertainer, quote, and a diplomat. A sketch of the suspect was released in 1975, showing, to my eyes, what looks like a young O.J. Simpson. An updated, aged-enhanced version of the sketch was released in 2019. It no longer looks like O.J. Simpson. Investigators are hopeful that DNA testing techniques will finally lead to a breakthrough in the case, just as it did for the Golden State Killer. They are also offering a $100,000 reward for the arrest and conviction of the Doodler. And again, I think I've talked about this before on the show, but if you put yourself in the mindset of a serial killer, especially the kind that seek, fame from their crimes. Now, we don't know if the Doodler counts as that kind. He wasn't sending notes to the police and that kind of thing, as far as I know, or to the newspapers or anything like that. But those kinds of killers that do, that they are hoping they will get some kind of, badass nickname that will strike fear into the hearts of their generation and generations to come, like Jack the Ripper or the Night Stalker or something like that. And the first time I really thought about this was when I heard about the weepy-voiced killer. And I said, what was that guy thinking when he woke up in the morning and opened the paper and read that his, badass serial killer nickname was the weepy-voiced killer? And now, I'd think the Doodler would be very similar. Although, maybe because it's so benign sounding, that makes it spooky. The Doodler is coming to get you. Well, he's uncaught, so I suppose maybe we shouldn't tease too much. But, yeah, I don't know. It's just something to think about. Serial killers and their nicknames. How much does it mean to them? What if they get stuck with one they don't like? We know some people, Zodiac and theoretically Jack the Ripper as well, chose their own nicknames. So, just something I ponder. And then, too, did he have, a real artistic temperament and sensibility? Like, when they called him the Doodler, was he like, Doodler? These are works of art. Was he offended by the term Doodler? As George Carlin would say, these are the thoughts that keep me out of the good schools. Number 2, the I-70 Killer. If you are a true crime fan at all, you've probably heard of this one. It's been covered on a lot of those true crime shows. It was even covered, like I said, on Unsolved Mysteries. The I-70 Killer is an unidentified serial killer whose killing spree began in Indianapolis on April 8th, 1992. It was at that time that he murdered a 26-year-old Payless Shoe Source manager, Robin Fuldauer. She was alone in the store when she was shot and killed sometime between 1:30 and 2 p.m. The next 2 murders occurred on April 11th at the La Bride d'Elegance bridal shop in Wichita. The victims were 23-year-old store clerk Patricia Smith and her boss, the store's owner, 32-year-old Patricia Majors. Investigators believe that the killer was under the impression that there was only one woman working in the store that day, since this is the only time that he attacked multiple victims. Smith and Majors had stayed past their normal closing time of 6 p.m. to allow a male customer to come pick up a cummerbund. Sometime after 6 p.m., the women allowed the killer into the store, believing that he was the customer that they were waiting for. After the women were murdered, the actual customer they'd been waiting for arrived to pick up the cummerbund, and he came face to face with the I-70 Killer. The killer looked at the man, but chose to flee instead of attempting to shoot him. The customer immediately notified police and would later provide details for the composite sketch. Of course, I will post it on Instagram. And the thing about this sketch, I don't mean to make light anytime we talk of all these things, but, sometimes things just remind you of things. This sketch looks exactly like a dude that I went to elementary school with. He looks like an older version, obviously, but it can't be Kobe because, he wasn't old enough at the time. But there's a dude that I know from Ashland, Massachusetts named Colby who looks a lot like this sketch. Anyway, wasn't him. Let's move on. On April 27th, 40-year-old Michael McCowan was stocking shelves in his mother's ceramic store, Sylvia's Ceramics, which was a store in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was shot and killed by the I-70 Killer. McCowan was the only man killed during the spree, and it's believed that the killer mistook McCowan for a woman because he had long hair that he kept in a ponytail. He was shot from behind while he was stocking some of the bottom shelves, so it's possible the killer walked in, saw the ponytail, thought this was a woman, and shot. On May 4th, 24-year-old Nancy Kitzmiller was working alone at Boot Village in St. Charles, Missouri. She opened up the shop at noon and was found dead by customers at 2:30 p.m. The final confirmed murder took place on May 7th at Raytown, Missouri. 37-year-old Sarah Blessings was working alone in her gift shop, the Store of Many Colors. The murder occurred during the day, and the owner of the video store next to Blessings' shop saw the killer enter, heard a pop, and then saw him leave the store. The video store owner ran next door and discovered Blessings' body. A clerk at a nearby grocery store also saw the suspect as he made his getaway running up a hill towards I-70. Investigators believe the same killer may be responsible for 2 murders in 1993 and an attempted murder in 1994, all of which occurred in Texas. The 2 murder victims were 51-year-old Mary Ann Glasscock, who was killed on September 25, 1993 in Fort Worth at an Emporium antique store, and 22-year-old Amy Vess, who was shot in a dance apparel store in Arlington on November 1st. The surviving victim was Vicki Webb, who was 35 years old. She was shot in January of 1994 in Houston at the Alternatives gift shop. She briefly talked to the shooter before he shot her in the back of the head. The bullet did not penetrate into Webb's head due to the large vertebra being hit. I get words. I understand English. The shooter attempted to shoot her again, but his gun misfired, and he left, presuming Webb to be dead. Police believe these 2 may be related to the same killer because the modus operandi of the Texas killer is very similar to the I-70 killer, and they both used a .22 caliber firearm, but ballistic tests determined that the gun used in the Texas murders was not the same one that had been used in the I-70 killings. So investigators have not been able to confirm that the I-70 killer was responsible for the shootings in Texas. Based on witness descriptions, we are able to produce 2 composite sketches of the killer and physical descriptions of the suspect. The I-70 killer was described as being a white man in his 20s or 30s, standing at about 5 feet 7 inches to 5'9". He was tall, thin, and he had lazy eyelids and sandy blonde or reddish hair in 1992. If he is still alive today, he would be in his 50s or perhaps late 40s. Now, I think that is one of the more terrifying serial killers because of the randomness. He did rob the stores, but these were not big cash businesses. He might have got maybe $100 or so from each store. And it seems like the murders were the actual motive, and there was no, sexual abuse or anything like that. So it seems like he really just wanted to kill, which I think is particularly terrifying. And again, random, aside from the fact that he tried to get women alone in a store. But yeah, I think that's one of the more terrifying killers until you hear about this next guy, which is our number 3 uncaught serial killer, Charlie Chopoff. Now I'm going to go ahead and give you a trigger warning here. I don't do trigger warnings very often on the show because you all know what you signed up for. This is spooky ass shit. You're going to hear some spooky ass shit. But this time it does involve crimes against children, and if you are a male in the audience, this might be especially cringy. I think you might be able to start guessing where he got his nickname from. Charlie Chopoff is an unidentified serial killer known to have killed at least 3 black children and 1 Puerto Rican child in Manhattan between 1972 and 1973. The perpetrator is given the nickname because he would murder his victims, but he would also mutilate them by cutting off their penises. In addition to the murders that he is believed to have committed, he is also believed to have attempted yet another murder on a child that got away. On March 9th, 1972, 8-year-old Douglas Owens' body was found, and it had been stabbed to death 38 times. His penis had been cut, but not fully severed from his body. On April 20th, another black youth was repeatedly stabbed. This time, his genitals were severed from his body, although he survived his injuries. On October 23rd, 9-year-old Wendell Hubbard was stabbed to death on the roof of an East Harlem tenement block. His penis had also been severed from his body. Almost a full year later, on March 7th, a 9-year-old Puerto Rican child named Luis Ortiz was found stabbed 38 times and also mutilated with his genitals removed. The 38 seems to be a recurring theme. That must have meant something to this killer. Finally, on August 17th, 1973, 8-year-old Stephen Cropper was repeatedly slashed with a razor on the rooftop of a tenement block. He eventually bled to death from the injury on his arm, although his genitals were left intact. Now, unlike the other cases that we've heard about so far, police do have a suspect, and they even named him publicly in this case. His name was Erno Soto, and he was arrested after the botched abduction of a Puerto Rican boy on May 5th, 1974. Soto confessed to the murder of the chopper's last suspected victim, Stephen Cropper. The only surviving victim of the Charlie Chop-Off attacks said that Soto did look like his attacker, but he was either unable or unwilling to positively identify him as Charlie Chop-Off. Now, the thing was, Erno Soto was actually a patient at the Manhattan State Hospital, a mental hospital, during the time of these murders. So they came forward and said, no, there's no way he could have done this because he was in our care, he was in our custody during the time that Stephen Cropper was murdered. And police went to the hospital and said, okay, so you're telling us he was absolutely here, there's no way he could have been out committing this murder. And then the hospital thought for a second and they were like, actually, wait a minute, that's totally possible because actually this guy, he gets out pretty often. Like he can escape. He knows how to escape. So he's been found off the hospital grounds before. Investigators believe that Soto is more than likely Charlie Chop-Off, but again, due to lack of physical evidence and uncooperative witnesses, and the unreliability of Soto's own confession due to his mental illness, no charges were ever brought against him. Now, look, I'm not an investigator. I'm just an armchair detective. But it does seem like the attack on the 8-year-old boy with the razor blade, from the way they describe it in these articles, or the Wikipedia anyway, it seems like a different kind of attack. It's not stabbing, it's slashing, right? So that's a different kind of thing. So I don't know about that one. What do you guys think? Do you think this man could have been possible suspect, or is this just what you might call a scapegoat for the real murderer who was never identified or captured? Okay, we are down to our last unidentified serial killer, and this one is striking a little bit closer to home. It's from my home state of Massachusetts. This one is known as the New Bedford Highway Killer. Now you'll notice that I said Bedford very carefully and clearly, because in my mind it's New Bedford, which comes from, just the Boston accent, of course, right? Which, by the way, I want you guys, do me a favor. Write in and tell me if you think that I have any kind of Boston accent or any other kind of accent. I mean, I suppose we all have some kind of accent. But, I grew up in Massachusetts, in the Boston area, my entire life. I certainly know people who have a Boston accent, including some of my own family members. I personally don't feel that I do have a Boston accent, but other people have told me that I sound very Bostonish at times, and I have picked it up on certain words or certain phrases that I use. So go ahead and let me know what you think. But anytime I think of New Bedford, there's an old commercial, and I can't even remember what it was for. I don't know if it was a car dealer or a furniture store, but whoever was doing the voiceover for the commercial had a wicked thick Boston accent. There's one of those words, right? Wicked. That's supposed to be a Boston-only word. But he had a wicked thick accent, and he would say, they had stores in New Bedford, Fall River, and Revere. And that sticks in my head to this day, and that's probably at least 20 years ago that commercial was on. Anyway, you didn't come to talk about Boston talk. you came to hear about unidentified serial killers. So let's wrap it up with number 4, the New Bedford Highway Killer. This is an unidentified serial killer responsible for the deaths of at least 9 women and the disappearances of 2 additional women in New Bedford, Massachusetts, between July of '88 and June of 1989. The killer is also suspected to have assaulted numerous other women. All of the killer's victims were known sex workers or substance abusers. While the victims were taken from New Bedford, they were all found in different surrounding towns along Route 40 in Massachusetts. There's really not a lot of info on this case. There's a couple books that I have not read yet, and those might have a little more detail on the victims and their lives and what exactly happened to them, how their lives ended. I believe that they were strangled, and I believe that they were left in random spots, off the highway, but not a ton of information. But if you're like me, one of the things you like in a true crime story is you like a list of suspects to think about and try to imagine, do I believe this person could have been the killer? Do I believe it was this one? And this story, although it's scant on the details of the actual crimes, at least we do have some suspects to get through. So let's do that now. The first suspect is known as the Choker. There were a dozen suspects in total, but 2 or 3 stand out, and the Choker is definitely one of them. He's one of the top suspects. Several sex workers had told police investigators that they feared this guy. His name was Tony DeGrazia, and they said that he had raped and choked them. When he was interviewed by police, DeGrazia admitted to choking the girls, but he denied killing anybody. A month later, a girl named Margaret Medeiros told a grand jury, quote, "He just lunged at my throat, and he tried to, he was twisting my neck. He was trying to snap my neck, and he told me that he was going to do to me like he did to those other bitches." DeGrazia was eventually charged with 4 counts of rape, 6 counts of assault and battery, and 1 count of assault with intent to rape. The alleged crimes concerned 6 sex workers, and all happened in the years following 1988, the same time span as the murders. After 15 months of incarceration and after 18 court appearances, DeGrazia was released on bail in January of 1990. Less than a year later, he was arrested again for another attack on another sex worker. He was charged with assault and attempted murder, but he committed suicide in July of 1991 before he could stand trial. So to me, just based on the scant evidence the story that we have so far, I think that seems like a pretty plausible suspect. The only thing that bugs me is that he was never caught murdering anybody. Rape is a different crime than murder. But of course, they did say that he strangled them, and these sex workers feared him, so perhaps these were rapes that just went a little bit further even, and he did end up strangling these women to death. But to me, that's still a viable suspect. I would keep him in mind. We move on now to our second suspect. This is a person that I call the prisoner. Well, this guy has lived a life. Wait till you hear this one. While in prison for stabbing his own mother to death, Daniel Thomas Tavares Jr. sent a threatening letter to one of the prison staff in which he indirectly claimed responsibility for the highway killings. Now, he did live in New Bedford during the murders, and he was known to have murdered a woman during the same time period and buried her body under a tree in his backyard. And I note here that although the crime did take place in 1988, he wouldn't be tried and found guilty for it until 2015. He was also convicted of 2 more recent killings in 2007. This was the murder of a couple from Seattle that he got in some kind of argument over $50 and ended up murdering them. So this guy was bad news no matter how you slice it. It's not clear exactly how he became related to this case, aside from the fact that he murdered a woman in the same time period, but to me it doesn't really fit. Again, this is all based on the very scant knowledge that we have from these little reports that we pick up along the internet, which basically means nothing. But going on what we do know, I would say this is not as strong a suspect because although it does seem that he had a habit of killing people, the woman that he buried in his backyard, I believe, was a neighbor of his. I'm not sure what the dispute was, but and it was buried in the backyard, whereas the victims in the highway killings were all found in areas off the highway. So it just seems like a different kind of crime. Definitely bad news. Definitely someone you don't want on the streets, but not the same kind of crime. So we move on to our third and final suspect, and this one is also a very interesting story. This is like a Better Call Saul kind of guy. This is the one I refer to as the lawyer. In August of 1990, a grand jury actually indicted somebody for one of the sex worker murders. The victim's name was Rochelle Doppolaria. Excuse me, butchering these names, but they get a little complicated. And the person they indicted on this murder was 40-year-old New Bedford attorney Kenneth Ponte. Now, like I said, this was a presumed highway victim, so if he was found guilty, then of course he'd be the main suspect for all the highway murders. And DePonte did have a criminal past, including drug use and prior domestic incidents with the victim in this case. I'm just going to stick to her first name. Usually I like to use the last name, but this is Doppolaria. Rala? It's a little tricky, so I'm just going to call her Rochelle and hope that she doesn't mind. This lawyer, Kenneth Ponte, he was a former heroin addict, a very heavy cocaine user, and he was known to invite local sex workers to his home. He would later claim that he was only trying to help them and offer them legal advice and somewhere to, clean up their lives, but it has been alleged that he would give them drugs in exchange for sexual favors. One of his house guests claims that he enjoyed watching pornographic videos in which a woman was being strangled and appeared to be dead. So he had connections to Rochelle, but he also had other connections to several highway victims as well. He had served as legal representation for two of the women, one of whom also worked at a video store which had been owned by Ponte. Another victim had been pounding on his door one evening, and one of the victim's sisters said that she had been dating a lawyer who the sister later identified as Ponte. He had moved to Florida in the late 80s, but he was arrested and charged with Rochelle's murder and returned to Massachusetts to stand trial in August of 1990. Bristol County District Attorney Ronald Pena suggested that Ponte had murdered Rochelle because she was allegedly planning to expose his drug activities. Ponte entered a plea of, quote, absolutely not guilty, and posted a $50,000 court bond. On July 29, 1991, the district attorney dropped the murder charges against Ponte, citing lack of evidence. The following year, the remaining drug and assault charges were dropped, and the New Bedford case went cold ever since. Now, this one I'm a little bit confused about because it sounds like he was already living in Florida at the time of some of these alleged murders. So, I don't know. He does seem like a very shady dude, and he's got connections to a lot of the women, but on the other hand, if he's someone whose work or play habits brought him in contact with local sex workers, then, that's, one doesn't necessarily mean the other. Just because you knew these people doesn't mean that, then he must have murdered them. So that's a tricky one. But I would say he is my number 2 suspect in this case. I like the first guy. Out of the people we've heard so far, I think the choker is who I would put my money on. But again, it's very scant information that we have, so we can't make a final decision, of course. And I am not alleging that any of these people actually did it, legal purposes. Although I guess the choker's dead, so, whatever. Not like he's going to come sue me. But again, just pointing out, just an armchair guy. These are just my opinions. What do you guys think? And also, which of these murders do you find the most terrifying? Like I said, I think the highway murder, but of course, Charlie Charpoff hits you on a different level, especially if you're a dude, I think. Of course, any crimes against children are bad, but the mutilation, even the surviving victim who's been mutilated, that's terrible. All right. Well, on that cheery note, let's wrap it up there. Once again, I want to remind you, check out the website, spookyas.com or spookyassshit.com. Find us on Instagram. We are at spookyassshit. And you can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyass. Please, please, please continue listening and sharing the show. Don't forget, next week we're going to have big announcements about the future of the show, changes to the show. Nothing real bad, don't worry, but some things that we want to talk about. And I'll probably discuss it a little bit on the closed Facebook group first, because that is what I consider my true blue spookaroos. So I want to give them the info first. Though it's like my council of ages, I suppose. I don't want to say elders, so I said ages, but you know what I mean. My wise council, my true believers, my true blue spookaroos. So that's who I want to talk to about this kind of thing first. So if you want that information, you got to go to Facebook and join that closed group. Of course, if you could share the show with any of your spooky friends, anyone who's interested in the kind of weirdo stuff that we talk about. And, you know, this show is all over the place. Sometimes we're talking about lighthearted things. Sometimes we're talking about serious things. But I've asked the spookaroos repeatedly how they feel about that. Would they rather I focus on one or the other and not mix it up the way that I do? And repeatedly, the answer has been no. We really like the variety. It's kind of like Unsolved Mysteries. You tune in, you don't know what you're going to get. And sometimes it's intense and sometimes it's funny. So, hey, listen, I am just your humble servant, your humble host, your humble servant. And I do what my whims tell me to do and what your whims tell me to do. So here we are doing this episode about Uncaught Serial Killers. Please, if you would, go ahead and leave a kindly worded review on Apple Podcasts or YouTube or Spotify or SoundCloud or wherever you happen to be listening from. Those kinds of encouraging thoughts go a long way, like I said before, perhaps even further than you think, because this is a true labor of love. I do not make money off the show, of course. It actually costs me money month to month, and it's really money that at this point is getting harder and harder to come by. So please, if you can do anything as far as leaving a review goes, kind words, that would be wonderful. But just the fact that you're listening, there's so many podcasts out there every single day. There's thousands more coming. And the fact that you found this little show and that you listen and hopefully are enjoying it and become a constant listener, that also means the world to me. And I thank you very much for it. And of course, I thank all my true blue spookaroos. Until next time, don't be afraid.